Welcome to the Human Performance Outliers Podcast with your hosts, Dr. Shawn Baker and Zach Bitter. At Human Performance Outliers Podcast, we dive into a wide range of topics revolving around health, nutrition, and physical fitness. If you enjoy the show and wish to support us, please visit patreon.com/HPO podcast. If you do not use Patreon but still wish to support us, please also consider checking out our PayPal page at paypal.me/HPO pod. The link to both of those can also be found in the show notes. Finally, please consider subscribing to us on your favorite podcast listening platform. Now, on to the next topic. Hey folks, Human Performance Outliers Podcast is growing, and due to the growth, we are looking to take on some new sponsors. So if you feel like your company or organization would be a good fit for our audience, please do not hesitate to reach out to hpopodcast@gmail.com. Thank you.
See what happens here.
What do you guys think?
We're up and rolling.
All right.
Get started.
Well, Zach, let's welcome Dr. Marc Bubbs. He is, I've been on Marc's podcast. I don't know. Have you been on Marc's podcast? I can't remember if you've been on there.
No, I don't think so.
Well, that maybe Marc put you on his. Are you still doing
Absolutely, yeah. We got to get you out for sure.
Cool. No, I'd be happy to. It'd be a blast.
So, Marc, tell the people a little bit about yourself. I know you are affiliated with you're a healthcare provider affiliated with the Canadian national basketball team, and you're interested in sports performance, obviously. So, tell us a little bit about your background, and then we can just start digging into some stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm the performance nutrition lead with the Canada basketball, and trained as a naturopathic doctor up here in Canada, and always had a background in sport and nutrition and exercise. So, even when it was working with general population in terms of helping with weight loss and, pre-diabetes and hypertension and all these things, it was just such big wins when you're using those tools. And then, of course, that dovetailed into just keeping athletes healthy. And, whether it's guys who are playing in college or the NBA or with our national team, it's such a big part of the puzzle for, especially for team sport athletes and, endurance as well. I'm sure Zach can speak to that. If you're not, if you're missing days because you're sick and run down, then that's really tough to perform in the long run. So, always had a passion for exercise and sport, and then, the nutrition piece laid on top of that. And then, here we are.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just not to sort of interrupt this thing, but I just saw that, I think Chris Paul in the NBA just put on a thing saying that after every game, he eats a Beyond Meat burger to feel better, for his recovery, which I find that a little interesting, considering it's basically a burger filled with processed seed oil and so on and so forth. Not to immediately be controversial, but
no, sure. I mean, there's some strange practices for sure. I mean,
they're invested in that company, and so it's kind of interesting to see what the athletes are willing to promote. Obviously in the name of, I don't know if it's the name of health or money, but I kind of be a little cynical. So tell us a little bit. So how is the transition going from the run-of-the-mill average person versus working with high-level athletes? I mean, what kind of considerations are different in those two populations?
Absolutely. There's a lot of different considerations. I think to start with, there's a lot of similarities between the two, although they're not maybe as obvious initially. And one of them comes into consistency. Whether it's on the nutrition front, the training front, and their skills, they're just consistent day in, day out, week after week, month after month, year after year. And that leads to that exceptional athleticism and all the athletic feats. And I think that's where a lot of the general population gets stuck. They struggle with consistency. They're shotgunning from one approach to the next. And that leads to a lot of plateaus and regressions. And so, that's definitely been something I've tried to relay to the folks I see in general practice, because it is, although they have different goals and obviously different genes and different skill sets, the training load's high when you're an athlete, but when you're someone who's working long hours and not sleeping enough and, struggling with weight gain, I mean, there's a lot of internal stress going on there as well. So it's just trying to relay those messages. And it always starts, as you guys know, nutrition, getting the training plan right, the lifestyle, the sleep, stress management, those types of things are just so fundamental, whether you're trying to feel good, look good, and get through the day, or if you're really chasing an athletic goal or a gold medal or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and it's one that I've always kind of found fascinating within the world of sports. And I think I first got exposed to it when I switched to a high-fat, low-carb diet years ago. And, it was interesting because I think a lot of times what people wanted to do kind of a surface level dissection of like, okay, well, this is how fat is metabolized in the context of endurance. This is how carbohydrate is metabolized in the context of endurance. And carbohydrate's a faster acting fuel source, therefore you're going to go faster with it. And it paid no attention to all those other things you mentioned, like your sleep quality, your energy levels through the course of the day, your recovery, and all these other things that actually mount up to putting you in a position to perform on race day. And that's not even to get into the context of the specific event too. I know the other thing I always get,
For sure,
you get really, I don't know if what I get with it, but it's just interesting that when people want to say like low carb diet for endurance, it's like, okay, continue. Are we talking the 1500 meter? Or are we talking a 24 hour? It's like people never want to narrow it down to the absolute context that's required to actually answer the question. And then you just get left with all this like almost meaningless back and forth, I guess.
Yeah, such a great point. And I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to write my new book here is part of that. One of the sections we talk about that endurance and a lot of Prof. Paul Larson's work and Phil Monfitone and that, great paper they wrote a few years back, Athletes Fit But Not Healthy, and distinguishing that idea of what is fitness, the ability to undertake an exercise task versus, health. What is health? Well, a state of well-being. And those two things, as they were seeing, especially at the elite levels, you're just seeing far greater amounts of athletes who are struggling with, physical symptoms, with deficiencies, with mental, emotional symptoms than should have been. And so this idea of overtraining even being almost a proxy for athletes who are in poor health, obviously things like training intensity and volume are going to play into that, but this picture of poor athlete health is a big reason for that. And just as you mentioned there, Zach, today's diet in terms of the processed food diet, ultra processed food. I mean, when you look at the US, Canada, and the UK, 50% of all household spending is on ultra processed food. And it's pretty crazy because if you're in London and you take the train to Paris, it goes down to 18%. They're eating real food. You go to, Italy, 14%, Portugal, 10%. And so just getting back to really, focusing on real food and ensuring that athletes are healthy enough, because that was a big one that came out not too long ago, is that, I think it was the British Sports Medicine Journal that, frequent illness is incompatible with elite performance. And so if you're, whether you're training for your own personal best marathon or whether you're more on the elite side, if you're constantly run down and sick, and we even see in the research now, you don't even have to be sick, right? Just upper respiratory symptoms. A lot of the work by Dr. Michael Gleason and Dr. Neil Walsh, even if you have symptoms, that's, again, signs that the engine's starting to overcook a little bit. And you got to get back to, working with your coach or your nutritionist, whomever it might be, to make sure that training plan's on point. And obviously I know you do a lot of coaching as well, Zach, and all your accomplishments, but those are things I'm sure that you must see a lot in people who come to you for help, right?
Yeah. I find it just like really interesting at the individual level with coaching. That's what I think I like the most about it, is everyone comes with a different package of circumstances. And it's like, you might have someone who's got a really stressful job, and that's going to be a hurdle that we need to kind of get over in terms of programming properly for them. And someone might come with all the time in the world to train, and then we need to decide, well, how much of this time do we actually need to use for training without kind of overreaching and doing more of something than is necessary, and end up like regressing because of that. And there's all sorts of other things. And I think, to me, especially in the world of extreme endurance, where there's still a lot to be learned from the scientific side of things, it's kind of mind-boggling to me how I wouldn't say how many people, but when people put down absolutes and determine like, this is the way to do this, and anything else is a compromise. And then I'm just like, that's kind of a cop out. That's not really the way it's going to work. And, folks are going to have their unique set of circumstances, and those set of circumstances are going to kind of create a path for their most successful situation. And as a coach too, like, I coach more folks who are like working a full-time job. They have a family and stuff like that. I don't coach a whole lot of people who are winning races or running at the front of the pack type of individuals. And I think it just adds an extra dimension, I think, at that point, when people have other priorities outside of just getting from A to B as fast as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing, the sort of the mental, emotional stress side of things. And, I know recovery experts like Dr. Shawn, I mean, that's her first go-to with all the recreational sort of athletes, even if they're kind of recreational elite, is that sleep, just that first pillar of, okay, are we getting to that 7 hours? Can we get to 8 hours? Where are the naps in there? Are the things compromising sleep? I mean, if you have little ones at home, it's tough. A lot of clients, that glass of wine or two at the end of the day feels pretty good, but all of a sudden we start bumping into the REM sleep, and then it's maybe a little more caffeine in the morning, and it's all sort of to get through the day in the short term. But at the end of the day, it starts to compromise some of these bigger goals that people might have. And unless somebody points it out to you, I think it's tough for a lot of people to just realize that these things are trickling into their routine, whether it's the food or the training and recovery.
And that's got to be kind of an interesting thing for you too, working with basketball players, because if the schedule with the guys you're working with or anything like, the NBA players, you look at some of these schedules where they're maybe playing late into the night one night and then heading to another city on the other side of the country the next day, and kind of doing that over and over again. And that's just the regular season. So like, in terms of establishing a sleep routine, I would think that would be one of the hardest things to kind of nail down.
I mean, it's definitely staggered, and even circling back to just Canada basketball. I mean, when I was growing up, we had one player, Steve Nash, playing on the national team, obviously phenomenal, 2-time MVP. And it's been amazing in Toronto the last 2 decades to see the growth, because now we've got more kids playing basketball than ice hockey in Toronto, if you can imagine that. And, now we're having to cut players who play in the NBA on the national team. So just, massive shift there. And it is a different schedule. Yeah. When you're playing in the NBA, it's all pushed back. So, I mean, guys are playing every night at 7 p.m., 7:30, sometimes 8. And then, you get done playing, there's all the adrenaline off of that. And so getting to bed, getting down to sleep is going to be much later. Oftentimes, if they're not fueling well, you'll see a lot of guys classically, some guys like Dwight Howard, classically like bags of Oreos before bed. I think Kyle Lowry kind of got leaner there a few seasons ago, and just by putting away some of that fuel that he was taking on board post games, when you're kind of not getting the right food in the dinner meal and not fueling adequately through the day, because it's tricky for these guys, even when they get to the gym or the arena ahead of time, they're there quite a few hours ahead of time, and so it actually makes it a little bit tricky to get the right fueling in. But nowadays the teams are really spending a lot of money on all the facilities, putting in the state-of-the-art kitchens, got the team chef, and trying to get the guys to eat in the facilities as much as they can. And it's a way for them to start to control fueling a little bit, which is, great for the players and great for the teams as well.
Hey, Mark, speaking of just fueling and diet, I mean, have you seen any, we're aware of, we've got these high level athletes that are clearly, they've got some genetic gifts, there's certain type of people that, even just height for basketball. I mean, you're not going to be an NBA star at 5'2", or, can't have a basketball team 5'2". So there's some genetic
for sure
advantages, and we see that in all kinds of top athletes, whether it's the NFL or other sports. And they, when you look at their diet, sometimes it's just absolute garbage. I mean, they're eating nothing but fast food. I mean, we see these guys that come into this at, 21, 22, 23 years of age, that is their diet, and that is what they have, lived on and done well on. But have you seen like a consistent pattern of diets that seem to work better than others for people, or is it just all over the place?
It's an interesting one, Shawn, because obviously sports like hockey, American football, rugby, when you're young, you get into lifting at a young age, and you start to put 2 and 2 together that you need to eat to be able to get big enough just to get on the field or on the ice, right? And so sports like basketball, even soccer, these kids have such a high skill level. And as you mentioned with basketball, in terms of height, if you're 6'8" and you've got a 44-inch vertical leap, and you're one of the fastest guys in a 40, and you can shoot and pass, I mean, you're going to get pretty close. And so oftentimes just like you mentioned, these kids are really young. You're going into the league at 19 now, 20 years old. And, if I think back to what I was eating when I was 18 or 19, it wasn't fantastic. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be learned on that side of things in terms of even, meal frequency through the day, getting enough protein in, getting enough total calories in. It's ironic because it's actually sort of almost the polar opposite of what we see in the general public. The person who's not doing enough activity or movement and totally over fueling all day long whilst they're sedentary. I mean, team sports uses up a lot of calories, the physical contact, the acceleration, deceleration, change of direction. It's, you need an awful lot of fuel. And this is where in sports like basketball, you start to see some of these non-contact injuries where guys are just landing from a jump stop and all of a sudden, fibula breaks, we get all these random injuries happening. And that's where you can see that picture of, low energy availability over a longer period of years building up, where all of a sudden you think, geez, these guys are having some of the random injuries where there's just really no contact. And so, yeah, the big thing with, especially even with guys who are seasoned vets in the league, but especially for our young guys, we start at 13 years old trying to, indoctrinate might be a bit of a strong word, but trying to get them used to the fueling pattern and what they need to take in. And they play so much. It's just a matter of really, it is like keeping them healthy is such a big part of it, because if colds and flus are a reality, and, studying when you're a kid as well is tough. But yeah, this is definitely some things to consider, because they can get away with a lot when you're, high skill sports like basketball or soccer.
Yeah, Mark, I think that's a pretty interesting point, and I've been talking about this for several years now, that I think the diet impacts, tissue quality and probably impacts injury rates. And I think we see, particularly in youth athletes now, we're seeing more and more pediatric ACL injuries and other injuries we didn't see, in people that were until they got older. And so some of the people think, well, the kids are just playing more sports now, they're more active. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think if anything, we see more kids are in it, less active. And we still, because I saw that in kids that weren't athletes that were tearing ACLs. I mean, they were out there playing on the playground, they went out there and did some running, and their strength to weight ratio wasn't what it should be. There's probably compromises to the actual tissues themselves. And so we see that. Is there a way that you guys, as far as injury mitigation, is there any way you guys can assess? You can look at an athlete and say, we can do this test or that test and say you're more likely to have. I know there's stuff with landing kinematics for ACLs and stuff like that. And we see it a lot with the females. But is there any kind of state-of-the-art test you can look at somebody and say, hey, you're more likely to have an injury based on this or that? One of the things that kind of intrigued me, and I should follow up on this point, is the phenomenon of these advanced glycation end products that infiltrate our tissues and combine with the proteins. And there are ways to assess that through like skin autofluorescent readers. And I just wonder if that would be something that might have, some utility in something like that. Because, you could easily do that. It's a 15-second scan and see what someone's advanced glycation endpoint load might be. And then you can kind of get an idea of what you could do over time to mitigate that. And there's probably other things you could look at. I know we see things like these industrial seed oils, which are, in this Beyond Meat burger that Chris Paul is touting about. It's accumulate in the fatty tissues, and probably in fact every single cellular membrane is going to have some of that incorporated. And I think for no good effect in my view. But anyway, any thoughts on that type of stuff?
Well, it's funny, just even circling back to the Chris Paul thing, the Netflix special there. What was it? What the Health? It's amazing how that can even influence player behavior, right? You get as much as we want people to make decisions based off information, Dr. Peter Jensen, our sports psych at Canada Basketball, is quick to point out, people make decisions based off emotions, and they make decisions based off of trust. And so all of a sudden, if you've got friends around you or family who are into they've watched a certain documentary and are eating a certain way, then it's amazing how that'll, they'll adopt that or decide to kind of jump into that. And so that's definitely one that we're always doing our best to help the guys out and to let them know what we'd like to do at Canada Basketball. And yeah, as it relates to injuries, we got a great team. Charlie Weingroff's our head strength coach, Sam Gibbs, performance director. And so, they've got a battery of tests that put the guys through every training camp to see, how they're moving, how they're performing. It is fascinating always to see, certain guys who don't score well on certain tests, and for whatever reason, injury rates are really low and no, no random non-contact injuries, and other guys can, obviously always trying to maintain, full range of motion and all these patterns, but you get some guys who just get more injury prone. And so it's definitely with regards to the testing. I mean, as guys get older, that's typically when they start to, and older in the NBA now is late 20s, early 30s, start to feel the joints a little more, all of a sudden more aches, more inflammation. And now, even though you've been telling them for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years about certain things, now they're ready to listen. They're ready to take it on board a little bit more, make a few changes. Again, things like sugars, particularly sugars late in the evening. I mean, if guys are going to be taking those in, we try to get it around training, around exercise, so they can at least burn it off. But the ones that start to interfere with sleep and the ones that late into the night, those are definitely the ones that can really start to add up. And we see on various tests, I mean, guys can't hide too much. You get the HA1Cs starting to creep up towards a high end of normal, and CRP starting to come up. And we started to do a little bit of work with CGMs to see how our guys are doing to certain players. And, even the waking fasting glucose, you'd obviously know about this, Shawn, but I mean, people would be surprised to see how high it can get in an athlete, and sort of highlighting the fact that they're not fueling the way that is best for them. And I think Zach touched on this before, where we have these sort of norms that we use across various sports. And it's great to have those norms, but we definitely need to be looking at the individual, because if we have guys who are, getting up to go to the bathroom every night and who struggle with real huge energy dips, we got to look under the hood and see what's going on. And that's what we try to do, with our guys at Canada Basketball, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we touched, Zach and I touched on this a while back. We had a guy on by the name of Alessandro Ferretti, and he saw the same thing with high performance athletes, that they were seeing, relatively high levels of glucose. And I had the same thing with me. And even though I was on a low carb diet, I saw relatively high fasting glucoses. I mean, my postprandial numbers were very stable, but I think there's something about the athletic physiology. And we know that, some of that, we know exercise is going to stimulate glucose release. I mean, your liver will dump glucose just to fuel your demands. And so I think there's some athletic physiology, and we don't know if it's pathophysiology or athletic physiology when it comes to that. So I think that's an interesting question. And I think it's something we need more information on. Hopefully more studies will come out, looking at that unique phenomenon. But how are you? So let's say you've got a guy who's, late 20s, early 30s. He's starting to feel, a little beat up. Obviously it's a stressful. What are you doing from diet, lifestyle? What things are you doing to improve that, if that's what the athlete's presenting with?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's around, even in terms of fueling, guys will be coached and told various programs or on teams to be taking in, simple sugars before games, but all of a sudden guys start having that an hour and a half before a game versus 15 minutes. And so, rebound hypoglycemia is sort of a real potential problem for some of these guys, where by the time it's tip off, all of a sudden it's low energy, guys are sluggish coming out of the game. And that's one where, some great research earlier on done by Mark Russell over in the UK with soccer players, and showing just that, if you started having these, again, sports drinks an hour and a half before your training or an event competition, I mean, rebound hypoglycemia is setting in right as you're about to take the pitch. And that's a big problem, because then it just sets guys up to struggle throughout the entire game. And you see that at halftime as well, just way too many simple sugars. And again, you kind of come out of the gates really slow in the second half. So sometimes that's individual players, sometimes that's a whole team, but that's a big place to start. And even around, with whether it's breakfast, first meal of the day, a lot of times guys are just used to, again, the total amount of fuel going in tends to be more on the, high glycemic side. If obviously it's a lot of issues with the glycemic index, but, more simple carbohydrate, but it's quite a ways away from training. Guys are still a couple hours before they're going to hit the gym. So I think a lot of the work now, and you see this in when I spoke with various performance teams in basketball and soccer as well for the book, you see more teams now strategically trying to reduce carbohydrate before specific training sessions. The carbohydrate intake of EPL football players over in England, through the week is much lower than it is on game days on the weekends. And that's definitely something that, for our guys at various times of the week, that's a great place to start, is with that breakfast. And, some of the work from guys like Dr. Samuel Impey, who's done some great stuff glycogen as a training regulator, right? So this idea of guys are just, from the research that came out in the 80s and 90s of just being high carb all the time and all continually topped up with glycogen. I mean, that can, sort of blunt some of the adaptations that you can get from training of having, liver glycogen stores that are depleted from an overnight fast, and then, a higher protein, higher fat breakfast, or even doing 2-a-days and some of those strategies that tend to be more for endurance type folks. But depending on, certain guys in basketball can be effective as well, especially guys who need to get leaner, or guys who naturally just have a higher, blood sugars are naturally a bit higher. And that's those guys who are, holding on to a bit too much weight. For an athlete, their body fat's too high. You see that, again, their fasting blood sugars are too high. That's when they've got to go against the trend for a lot of these guys and eat in a different way. And it's tough in the locker room when most of those guys, I mean, even after a 2-month off season, will come in for testing and it's, 6-7% body fat after they've done whatever they want for 2 months. So, it's a very interesting cohort of athletes, right?
Yeah. That was a question I wanted to ask you, is kind of related to that. We've talked quite a bit on this podcast about how youth can mask a bad diet. I'm sure you see that with the youngsters.
Big time, yeah.
You get the 24, 25-year-old guy who's just like a physical freak, and he's 5% body fat, and he can eat junk food all day long. And I mean, you mentioned Dwight Howard. The guy looks like a Greek statue, and he's popping up Mountain Dews in the middle of the night and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly right.
But I guess my question is, like, have you seen a lot of folks who are in their youth still, so like mid to upper 20s, decide okay, I'm going to really target nutrition as a way to take myself to the next level, and kind of switch from a standard American diet to a more strategic performance-based diet, and then come back to you and say, wow, I would have never known that this was possible. And I'm curious, because you see that happening sometimes when you get guys in their 40s where they kind of have to make those changes. But
Yep.
You might have a unique perspective of people who technically maybe could get away with it a little longer, but switch anyway.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's always that trying to find that buy-in with young athletes. Like, how do you show them that this is an important thing to take seriously when, as you mentioned, if you're 18, 22, 25, you can really get away with a lot of this stuff. And we've seen, our guys who play elite collegiate basketball, NCAA, who don't go into the NBA will go over to Europe to play professionally. And that's often a really eye-opening moment, because if they're playing in Italy and Spain and Germany, again, the diets there are really, real food based, right? There's very minimal processed food. One of our guys, Kevin Pangos, who used to play at Gonzaga, he played over in Lithuania, really prominent league over there. And that was a classic scenario of a guy. He already, took his training seriously and his nutrition seriously, but he really wanted to focus on everything and really, emphasize his recovery, because it is a grueling season. It's a much more physical brand of basketball in Europe. It's a bit more like, if you remember some street ball back in the 90s, or the NBA maybe back in the 90s, but it's a really physical game. And so, yeah, he layered in, we work closely together. He layered a lot of stuff in on the nutrition front in terms of recovery and just total fuel, in terms of really setting his protein intake. So based on his body weight, of having a specific target for his daily intake, and just getting used to that meal frequency and intake, so that at the end of the day, he doesn't even have to think about it. He just knows off a habit how much he needs to get in on that front. And, had a great season, played really well. And then, this year is over at Barcelona, which the Spanish league right after the NBA is the next best league in the world, really, in terms of talent and whatnot. And so, he got the move over there, and it's just a testament to, again, if you, guys who put the work in all facets, right? Because I think a lot of times in sports, athletes don't realize, every basketball player is putting in a lot of time on the court and skills, but not all of them are putting the time in on the nutrition front or the recovery front. And so finding some gains there so that you can be, fresher and adapting better and making it through. I mean, these are long seasons, and they're really, you're playing for 6, 7, 8 months. If you can maintain your ability to accelerate and recover as you get into those latter months is huge.
Hey, let's shift a little bit over to the recovery front. So what do you when, other than getting good sleep, what are you finding is effective for recovery? I mean, there's been, back and forth on cryotherapy, there's a whole bunch of different, whether massage works or not. What actually seems to really work? What do we have good solid data on that works in both practice and in the lab?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question because it's obviously so important today. Teams are always looking at how they can get guys to recover better. And I spoke with Lachlan Penfold, who's the former performance director for the Golden State Warriors, and now back in Australia working with the Melbourne Storm of the National Rugby League. And he's got sort of a recovery pyramid that he works with, and at the base of that pyramid is going to be nutrition, sleep, and then that mental emotional stress side of things, which he rates pretty high, especially in team sports, because you just never know what's going on in the rest of somebody's life in terms of whether it's family, relationships, whatever it might be. And so from there, that's the bottom rung. And then after that is that training plan, in terms of who's laying out that training plan. Is that training plan gearing you towards your goal? And of course, it's never perfect, but you're trying to get yourself towards that end goal. And those are really the biggest rocks. And, he mentioned to me, you could take all the ice baths you want, but if you fuck up the training plan, you really, you're not gonna make it, or sleep or nutrition. Right. And so those are the biggest rocks. And as you get higher up, you get in the modalities like, physical therapy and massage and whatnot. And at the very top of the pyramid, you've got the different techniques like, cryotherapy or ice baths. And then speaking with him and again, Shawn, who's a recovery expert at Australian Institute for Sport. I mean, there's no real consensus really in terms of, whether one is superior than the other. 11 to 15 minutes of cold seems to be what the evidence supports. But it's interesting because you talk to guys like Lachlan, he just says, look, I give my guys the choice. They can pick the hot, they can pick the cold, they can pick the duration. But the fact that he gives them the choice, then they're more likely to do it and more likely to do it consistently. And he knows that they're getting some in, every single practice, every single game. And that becomes the more important factor, which, I really find fascinating because, again, sometimes we start to try to tease out exactly what the best modality is for that individual. And no doubt there's probably some room there, but that notion of just consistency, whatever the player or athlete is willing to actually do time in and time again. And I think that's why you've seen, cryotherapy increase because, even though the temperatures are, stupidly low, it obviously doesn't conduct like water. So your actual internal temperature is no different than taking an ice bath. But when you talk to team directors and performance directors, if a guy only has to spend 3 minutes in a cryotherapy instead of 11 minutes in an ice bath, then all of a sudden there might be a little bit more, even though again, the research is a little bit equivocal in terms of the support. It's easier for them to build up player buy-in to do that. And so, obviously on my end with the guys, it's always nutrition first and the total fueling, especially if you get into, for us, again, we'll have the World Cup in the fall, and that's a game every other night. And so you get into these compressed windows of scheduling, and that's where total energy intake, again, total carbohydrate intake, all these things become pretty huge for recoveries for basketball. And so, those are definitely some of the big rocks for making sure that we're getting recovery in. And of course, if you do that well, then you can avoid the colds and flus. That's the big thing. Guys get run down, colds, flus, upper respiratory tract symptoms. That's when things start to go wrong. And then regardless if you're a team sport, endurance, you cannot maintain that level throughout a long competitive schedule.
Yeah. I mean, imagine, and I remember when I was playing high level sports as a youngster, I mean, there was alcohol was part of that culture. I don't know if you have to deal with that too much of the guys are kind of figuring, I mean, it's tough to be a 20-something-year-old guy and not want to, run around and have a little bit of fun. So, I mean, that's got to be something you've got to figure out how to manage that stuff as well. Do you find that dealing with trying to convince these guys not to go out and get hammered on the weekend is a problem, or are they pretty much realizing that's not going to help them?
Well, I mean, it's funny because in the research, athletes binge drink more than the regular population. When obviously you played rugby, Shawn, so I mean, certain sports do have cultures around. And I think just today's athlete, as in generations past, I mean, the amount of alcohol, I guess there was, you didn't have cameras, the internet, there was a lot more drinking going on in the past, even with today's athletes. So you see more guys, they're going to go out, they're going to have fun. That's part of the whole deal for them. And it's more a matter of trying to help them time it in a certain way so that it's obviously not interfering with important parts of the schedule. And I mean, this is where you get into monitoring devices, in terms of collective bargaining agreements with people don't want sleep monitors, right? They don't want you to know what they're, who owns the data and all this type of stuff. So, I'd say especially our younger guys, though, they're really motivated and on the ball and everything else. And then, as guys get older and work their different ways in whatever professional league that they're in, some guys just want to have a good time. And I always try to let them know you don't have to be perfect. If we can always, even if you want to be more on that side of things, we can always just increase the playing field a little bit, in terms of how we, things like even drinking non-alcoholic beer. The German Winter Olympics team in the last Winter Olympics, that's what they were hydrating with the bobsleigh men, because hydrate's better than water. And the team doc said, well, I know we'll drink it, so we'll just give them that. So there's little ways of doing things that if you know your population and you can kind of tweak things a little bit, then you gotta try to do that, right? Because no one's, just because I think nutrition's really important and really cool, it doesn't always mean my athlete does. And so finding that level of buy-in is huge for sure.
Plus you get the added benefit of one of the guys getting placebo drunk and then laughing at him afterwards, knowing he took in 0 alcohol.
Absolutely. And they just came out with a study actually for Alyssa's coffee, but University of Toronto just showed that if you're a regular coffee drinker and you just look and smell coffee, you get all the cognitive benefits as if you had drunk it. So, I mean, just like you said, man, we're Pavlov's dog more than we think. And I'm pretty sure if a bunch of guys drank, near beer, they would actually start feeling pretty loose, even though they were, just hydrating.
I wanted to follow up on one thing when you're talking about the ice baths and the cryo. I actually heard recently that like those can be some really good kind of tools to use in the midst of a big like training block to get you from one hard session to the next. But ultimately it's kind of trying to bypass the recovery to a degree. So at some point you want to do like maybe a deload week or a recovery day where you don't do that stuff and let that inflammation actually set in. Is there any truth to that? Or do you think like some of these cryo ice bath things are just something people should be incorporating on a more routine basis, like full stop?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, Zach. And it's one, again, Shawn Halston's done a lot of work in this recovery side with cold and heat. And definitely depending on the training block, if you're in more of an adaptation phase, you've got to really watch that you don't start adding in too many ice baths or cryo, or, if you're taking supplements like antioxidant based supplements and things that are going to blunt this natural inflammatory process, which is triggering all these adaptations to take place. Whereas, if you get into a competitive schedule and now it's time to keep you going from one, maybe it's a peaking stage in terms of before competition or between competitions, that's when we've just got to maintain what you've built through that, through your training block. And so that's where you get even more benefit from a lot of the modalities that are going to start to really blunt inflammation. So that's what, your ice baths, your cryo, various nutritional strategies. That's when you can really have the biggest bang for their buck. And Shawn has done some nice work with kind of having that, periodized recovery, just like you periodize your nutrition or your training, and using hot and cold and different training blocks. And she's done some cool work with endurance athletes, which we cover in the book, that you can then start to, just get a good sense of what you should be doing as you're building up. And maybe, the strategy is likely going to change as you're peaking towards that big event that you're trying to hit. And you got to make it to that next intense session, as you mentioned there, just so that you can get all that training in to be able to compete at your best.
Yeah, one of the things that, and this is, obviously I'm sort of biased in this, but as someone who's been, I've been training for 40 years now, and, I'm very acutely aware of how my body feels. I've got a lot of cumulative miles on there, and Zach does too,
Nice.
running hundreds of miles. And we've both noticed that the incorporation of more animal-based products, particularly red meat in the diet, seems to help with recovery. I don't know if that's something that you and your athletes, I know there's some athletes now that are adopting a plant-based strategy. Have you had any experience with that, or are you noticing anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those, there's just so much emotion wrapped up. I mean, and obviously you know this better than anyone, Shawn, but there's so much emotion wrapped up in the term red meat, right? I mean, if you just labeled all of the proteins, essential fats, minerals, etc. of this food and just labeled it X, every performance nutritionist, everybody in the general public, every doctor, practitioner would say, that's perfect. That's a great food. give it to me. But we have such a preconceived notion of what's going on with, or what we think is happening with red meat and inflammation, all these various factors. That's a huge one that comes up. Guys will be avoiding red meat for quote unquote health benefits, and yet we're replacing it with things that are going to be processed. We're replacing it with, unfortunately, hey, if people want to eat more vegetarian or vegan, then there are real food sources of those you can go to. But once we start getting into the fake and packaged meats, that's when we're really starting to have a recovery drop. And guys can get away with it when they're young in terms of performance, but it's going to catch up with them, especially as you get to the late 20s, 30s, definitely past 40 is when, you see that all the time, especially in day-to-day practice. And even when we look at the research around just morning fasting glucose in terms of mortality, cardiovascular disease risk, if you're in the highest quartile, then you're much, much greater risk of cardiovascular disease. And of course, the Whitehall study showing a dose-dependent response to that. And so I think sometimes we got to say, hey, if these foods are reducing fasting glucose in the morning for these folks, fantastic. Inflammation's coming down. If it's the general public, things like belly fat, abdominal circumference, that's getting a lot better. We seem to lose the forest through the trees sometimes with being so bought into certain strategies that we don't zoom back out to 30,000 feet and say, okay, what are all the markers telling me? What's the subjective, information from this patient or athlete? And if all these things are looking good, then, this is where we're sort of good to go. And these days, unfortunately, people are trying to follow directions. Again, this is maybe more general population, but they're trying to follow certain patterns and they're struggling. They're not, the classic is people who train for a marathon. They train for months and months and months and lose virtually no weight, even though they're trying to. And that is just a classic scenario of folks just not fueling appropriate for them. And, even now in the research, 30 to 50% of the training sessions says, the ACSM and dietitians of Canada, that people should be fueling with that for endurance. And if you're recreational, for me, it's got to be even 2/3 at least, because you just don't need, that excessive fuel on board is going to really start to hamper their ability to use their own fuel reserves. And then they just never get in a position where the glycogen status is low enough to elicit some of this really great adaptations that happen at a cellular level as well. So it's, I think sometimes we almost make it too complicated,
Yeah. We've touched on that a bit in previous ones, where it's like this new age of running, or the most modern kind of wave of running, seems to be focused a lot more on, I'm going to do this so that I can justify a bad eating habit, or I'm going to do this as kind of like a one-off challenge. I'm just going to try to complete a marathon. And there's very little attention paid to the process. And then the folks who are paying attention to the process are buying into some of these kind of protocols that are being pushed out by kind of the sports supplement companies, where you need to have have your gel every 20 minutes or have your sports drink every 45 minutes. And it's like, here you have a person who's going out for a 4-mile run and they're consuming the number of calories they're burning on that run with their inter-workout and pre-workout fuel sources. And, it's some of the lowest quality nutrition you can probably find in terms of just holistic food choices. And it's like, it's no wonder people are gaining weight training for a marathon.
Oh, for sure. And you dovetail that into the speed they're running too. They don't even need carbohydrate. They should be fueling just off the fat. If they're running at 65, 70%, it really is. And then it leads to a whole host of problems. It's a shame, because obviously these folks are dedicating so much time. It's time away from family. It's time away from work. They're trying to improve their health really is a big part of it. I'm sure you see that, Zach, of people are doing this as a challenge, as a goal. They want to improve their health. And literally 4 months later, they might be in worse health. Physically, in terms of just the pounding on the joints. And so I think there's a great place for, obviously all the great work that you guys do, but there's a great place to help people fuel a bit better. And in that whole idea of training day nutrition being different than race day nutrition. And I think that's kind of an easy way for people to start thinking about this. And, once you tell them if you're 10% body fat, you could, 30, 40,000 calories, you could run 15 marathons. It's like, it sort of resets. Like, wait a minute, what did you say? Like, I think we've just scared everyone out of having this hypoglycemia. And even in the research with elite endurance, we see more of that hyperglycemia. Like we're overfueling when a lot of the stuff coming out with the continuous glucose monitor, some of the case studies, The one out of Japan there, I think it was Sengoku was the first author, and there was one elite runner and one sub-elite, and the elite is fueling just perfectly. You know, the rate is just to a T, and the glucose is strong, and the sub-elite is just over-fueling, and the blood glucose just keeps rising and rising and rising as they're training, as they are competing, and then eventually they bonk and hit the wall, and it's, you know, it's just not, unfortunately, you know, not tailored enough to that individual that's in front of you, as you mentioned, Zach.
Yeah, you know, it's a perfect example of context too. It's like you have the person who's training for their own personal benefits or their own personal targets, and you have the Olympic caliber marathon runner it's just a apples and orange comparison almost at that point. And, you know, I'll see it all the time, like within the ultra running kind of community. You know, it's to me, like that's the community that makes the most sense for a high fat, low carb diet as an option, at least.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to argue with anyone who wants to follow a high carb approach and it works for them and they're, you know, making improvements and healthy otherwise. It's like, great. I'm happy for you there. I'm not trying to push anything onto people, but like the dismissal of it's what kind of bothers me when it gets to, you know, these events that are so long that, you know, you're at 65 to 70% your VO2 max. So like, you know, like at that point,
perfect.
Yeah, you can start to really consider some alternative options, and then putting down on an absolute is the last thing you should be doing in that world or in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, even in other sports too. I mean, when I interviewed Prof. Larson, he was telling me at a blood glucose of 3.0, he was cranking out 250 to 300 watts for 3 hours, you know, and felt great. And of course, classically in the literature, that would be hypoglycemia. That would be watch out, start to, you know, bring in the gels and everything else. And I think that's where, there's just this huge gap here. And of course, you know, race day nutrition being different. I mean, I think that's a different animal, and there's a lot more agreement in terms of more or less what should go in. But I think in terms of that training, there's just still so much to be, and that's why it's always cool to see elite athletes doing it first, and then the researchers are then trying to figure it out and go back and assess and find out how it's working, versus, you know, you're always getting the athletes at that level pushing the boundaries first, and then science trying to explain or get us close to the truth, you know, after the fact, for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you know, and that's one of the things I always find myself getting into a discussion about is, you know, ultimately, like I'll run a race and someone will look at what I'm fueling with during the race, and they'll want to point to that as kind of as a picture of what my lifestyle's like. And then I find myself having to explain, it's like, no, like I consume more carbohydrates on race day probably than I did in almost the entire training block leading up.
The whole 2 months before that.
Yeah. So and usually what I found is the easiest way to get people to kind of understand it, because so many people bypass this concept of that there's a periodization in training and nutrition. So like they always want to look at kind of a micro analysis, like take one day out of my calendar year and say, okay, this is what this guy's lifestyle is like. When in reality, like I might have one of the most diverse lifestyles, in the sense that like there may be a day where I'm running all day, and there may be a day where I don't get out of bed. So it's like,
for sure,
you know, I'm going to fuel differently the day I don't get out of bed versus the day where I'm running all day long. And so what I'll usually tell folks is, like, if you look at the full year and average everything out, you're going to see roughly on average about 100 miles a week of training. So I'm hitting historically 5 to 5,500 miles per year in training. And then that's all periodized with recovery and big buildups, workouts and all other stuff, races. And then nutritionally, you know, my window of carbohydrate intake can be anywhere from 0 grams in a day, like quote unquote 0 grams, to, you know, upwards to like 20 to 30% of my daily intake, depending on what I'm doing. And over the course of the year, it averages out to be right around 10%. So I think most people would be very willing to say that's a low carbohydrate approach to life in general. But it gets really kind of complicated when you try to like look at it in kind of a tunnel versus the whole approach. And that's where I think sometimes people get tripped up and they don't really know what to do, or they don't know, they feel like they're trying to kind of plug what I'm doing into their context, which is a mistake right out the gate. But
yeah, it's funny how people do that too. They'll take somebody who's elite, you know, national champion, record holder, and then it's like, okay, well, I'll just fuel the way they are, even though I'm 20 pounds overweight and I'm just doing this marathon for the first, and it sounds kind of funny when you say it out loud, but I think it's natural for people to want to emulate, but I think you're very right in the sense that, yeah, I mean, they can't just level that onto themselves. And then, and for someone like yourself, obviously having those periods where you're having a bit of carbohydrate just keeps that gear intact. So when you need it, when you race, then it's ready to go, and you haven't lost it in terms of having, zero or very low carb exclusively all the time, right?
Yeah. You maintain that, I guess, metabolic flexibility is probably the best way to look at it. Like, I don't lose the ability to utilize carbohydrates, but I don't rely on them so heavily that if I find myself in a tough spot in a 100-mile race where the temperatures get up to 100 degrees and, hydration is on the fritz and, fueling is just simply not an option from a digestion standpoint, I can get through that section versus having the wheels completely come off. And I just think when you're looking at the number of variables in a 100-miler, and then, 100 miles now are becoming kind of like a step in ultra running because people are doing things like just longer than that. And
yeah,
it's really fascinating to think about like the number of variables that you're considering at that point and kind of how all this stuff fits within that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously at your level, that would be massive. And I think even as you mentioned before, just your consistency with your training. I mean, everyone could learn a thing or two just about the fact that, you know what you're doing per month, per year, you're banging it out all the time. And that's gotta be 80% of the whole story, right? In terms of whether it's endurance, elite team sport, someone trying to achieve their goal, is just having a really solid plan, sticking to it. And then that last 20% kind of tinkering around with that individualized approach with whether it's a coach or a practitioner or a team doc or whoever it might be. But I think sometimes people get, as you mentioned, kind of dialed into that shiny new toy or something beforehand, and they're trying to adopt a strategy that an elite person uses before they've got all their real fundamentals in place, right?
Yeah. I actually had a question for you, and if this is something outside your kind of expertise, feel free just to say so. But
yeah,
I've been intrigued with this question or this thought where with in-race fueling or in competition fueling. And my first thought was like along the lines, especially within extreme endurance, is like fat fuel intake is something that should almost be, I don't want to say completely avoided, but not kind of focal point of your fueling strategy, because even the leanest elite athletes, like you said earlier, have enough body fat to get them through an event, and they can always replace that afterwards if they feel like they got too lean throughout the course of the event or something like that. So that's like kind of your onboard fuel tank that you don't have to worry about. You can bypass digestion, don't even tempt fate with that. And then you come down to your kind of glycogen stores, which is your finite fuel tank. That's the thing you might want to kind of keep an eye on, especially if you're going to be out there for an entire day. But then this was posed to me a while ago, was like this idea that maybe eating something could stimulate like a central nervous system response. And what I find really interesting about the mental side of extreme endurance is a lot of times it's your mind that's the limiting factor, not necessarily your body. So if you find yourself, say, 75 miles into a 100-mile race and you're just very unmotivated to kind of push that pedal down or keep that pedal down, but then you eat something, is that like, I think caffeine's probably another example of something you could utilize in this situation to fire up your central nervous system and kind of give you that mental motivation to kind of keep going. And then with that, like, is that kind of open the door to fueling with fat if that's something that just happens to sit well in your stomach, or you're following a more strict ketogenic diet, so you're going to be more inclined to be eating those type of foods?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, at that distance, I mean, if we think of just carb mouth rinsing, I mean, that's, evidence-based strategy. You see it all the time in team sport. In the last World Cup, you probably noticed all the soccer players spitting everything out onto the field. And so there's a really cool example of the taste buds connecting, through the medulla and thalamus to the cortex, the taste centers there, and then impacting the central nervous system. And so you get a definitive performance edge. And, if people are trending more low carb or keto, personally, I would feel that's a really potential advantage to take potential place to take advantage of right now. At that stage of a race, I mean, initially I would always want to try to drip feed in some fuel consistently for that individual. even things like obviously honey, isomalt is a slower burning carbohydrate that can, do a little bit better for some folks, but definitely the central nervous system effect of the carb mouth rinsing. And then you can get into things like, caffeinated chewing gum in terms of that, the speed that it gets taken up. So this is, again, if you think of team sports, a guy coming off the bench, if he has a coffee before a game, that coffee's peaking and guy's not playing until the second half. It's difficult to know when to be taking some of these ergogenics. And even a baseball player coming off the bench as a pinch hitter, the chewing gum's a great way because it's going to get into the system really quick as well. Mm-hmm. So I think, flushing out those strategies and how it feels. And as you mentioned, the gut's obviously a huge part of this whole story in terms of what people can tolerate. And, in certain camps, folks like Asker Ukendrup in terms of really pushing the ability for the gut to just take up and trying to push as much fuel in there as you can and train the gut, so to speak, which is, obviously a different camps, but that's one strategy that they're trying to accomplish in terms of being able to take more fuel in. Obviously, somebody on a low carb or keto, that's going to be more like the opposite approach. So you're better off to be finding that right amount. That's, once you get over 2 hours, having that right amount that's going in is going to be pretty crucial. And then I think, as you mentioned, the brain is going to be that central governor, right? It's the one that's kind of holding you back. So between your own mindset and that ability to just have something that peaks it a little bit. So, those might be strategies in terms of the dietary fats. I mean, with some of the recreational guys that I work with, it's a bit hit or miss in terms of how they tolerate it. I've had some athletes who tolerate it well and others who really can't tolerate it at all. So obviously through the training blocks, one to experiment with.
And that's what I always tell folks I'm working with is when we get into like long runs and training, once we get kind of probably about halfway through the training block for their goal race, we start breaking their long runs into like field tests into two categories. And one is like a fat adaptation field test where it's like, we want to find out how fat adapted you actually are out in the environment you're going to be racing in. So we'll do like, say, a 4 or 5 hour long run with just water and electrolytes. Let's see how you feel. Do you feel like your energies are dipping at the end, or do you feel consistent the whole way? And then the other one is let's practice what you're going to do during the race. So this is running through your plan A, your plan B, and your plan C from a fueling standpoint. And we're going to practice that, maybe not to the gram quantity that you would do in the race, but let's find out if that nut butter sachet sits well in your stomach, or let's find out if that sports drink sits well in your stomach, and really just establish what's gonna be something you can lean on during that second half of a long race.
And it is always fascinating in terms of the stuff that people like. Something might even go down well, but they don't like it. And so they don't want to have that particular thing. And you think, geez, we just nailed the right thing. And now it's amazing dealing with humans, all the different variables of what you need to do to actually accomplish the task. But that's a great point.
Hey, Marc, let me ask you about longevity. As we see athletic performance, athletes are getting bigger, they're stronger, they're faster, they're doing more and more things. It just continues to evolve, and then obviously there's things to do, and people take performance enhancing drugs just to allow some of that. But are you seeing that the athletic career is lengthening or shortening, or can people lengthen their careers more than we could before? I mean, we see guys like Tom Brady, competing at the highest level into his 40s now. Are we seeing that across the board in sports that people are maintaining performance? I know personally, when I compete in the sport I do, I'm still hanging with guys that are in their 20s, even at Olympic levels in rowing. But I mean, what are you seeing in general with these high level athletes? Are they just, is it demands just so high now that they're burning out quicker, or are they lasting longer?
It's funny you mentioned that about Tom Brady. I'm a Buffalo Bills fan, so I'm happy to see him retire soon. If that would work out a lot better for me. But I mean, it's I think for me, the sleep and nutrition. You look at a guy like Roger Federer. I mean, 37 is ancient in tennis. Everybody written him off a few years back when he was struggling, and then he comes back and wins multiple majors back to back, U.S. Australian Opens, gets Wimbledon. I mean, he's still dusting guys off who are in their mid to late 20s. And the heavy focus there on nutrition, on some of the recovery modalities and sleep as well. And you see it in the NBA as well. I mean, Steve Nash is a great example. There's a guy who obviously massively skilled player, had tremendous physical qualities, but not when you compare it to NBA level and he was able to play until he was 40, and even with a spondylolisthesis as well in his back. So that was just having to take that nutrition really really seriously, and get that recovery in, get the sleep in, and just be consistent with it. I mean, as you know, Shawn, it gets a bit monotonous and boring, but just to be able to follow through on that and be diligent with it day in, day out. And then that's when you start to see a bit like a endurance analogy or metaphor here, in the marathon, that last little stretch when you start pulling away, it's because the other guy's getting slower, not because you're getting faster a lot of the times. And I think that's what happens now in the careers with guys really taking care of their, and even with the metrics that we can use now in terms of, again, the HA1Cs, of CRPs, all these various blood markers that we can use around even recovery as a way to tell us, hey, how is this guy tracking? Or whether it's technology, whether it's HRV, whether it's even subjective wellness questionnaires. So on that strength and conditioning side, I think we're a little bit better at really teasing out how to stimulate the athlete to get the adaptation without crushing them with volume and really getting the wear and tear on the joints, like, a few decades ago might have been the case.
Yeah, I mean, we always hear, like, guys in the NFL, its average career length is about 3 years. A lot of them get injured, and it's just they can't perform at that level. But it is interesting to see that we are seeing. Was it Tiger Woods just came back and won a tournament, won the Masters.
Oh, amazing, yeah.
When people had written him off and he'd had injuries, and so it's interesting. What we're able to do now with nutrition and recovery, and I think it's pretty encouraging. And my belief is that, and this is outside of sports, but I don't think we're designed to decay and decline and have all this health issues that we come to expect as normal. And again, this is just for the average person, but we have so many people that, they expect, once I get 40, it's all downhill. I can resign myself to a life of back pain, hypertension, and
yeah.
And the dad bod. And I think that's just ridiculous that we've come to normalize that. It's very nice to see, these athletes, at a high level proving people wrong. And I think hopefully it'll rub off on the rest of the population.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right in the sense of just because something's common doesn't mean it's normal. And we sort of confuse those two things. I mean, it's common that everyone's getting overweight and, pre-diabetic and hypertensive, but I mean, that's not the normal. We should be, I think that's why I love it. In terms of sports, great. There's an outcome, you win or you lose. And I think when we take that mentality even to medicine, it's like, are we winning? Is this person getting healthier? If we're not, then we got to be ready to do some strategies that are a little bit left or right of what we think is right, because we're not getting the desired outcome. And I think that's where sport really helps, because it's, are we getting better? Are we winning? Are we losing? Because in that scenario, then the teams are ready to keep pushing until they get the outcome they're looking for.
Well, it's interesting too, especially when you get into these more popular professional sports like NBA, MLB, and NFL type stuff, and worldwide soccer or football, is you extend your career 2 years. That's millions and millions, in some cases almost tens or close to hundreds of millions of dollars on the table if you can manage to do that. And we're seeing guys like LeBron James now invest. I think I saw a stat somewhere where he sinks like just north of $1 million a year into just like rehab, recovery, and nutrition based stuff. Because he knows, like, if he does that, for his entire career and adds 2 extra years to his legacy, that's probably a blank check. It's insane.
For sure. I mean, you hit right on it. I mean, again, you're always trying to find that thing that motivates certain guys, and some guys it's more on the performance side, and other guy, or the legacy side even, and other guys. And obviously it's normal for, in terms of contracts, yeah, exactly 1 or 2 more contracts. If you get your sleep right, you take your nutrition seriously. I mean, it's a lot of money. So it's one of the reasons why we're seeing such a trend in that direction. So it's good to see.
Cool. I don't want to take up too much of your time, Marc, if you need to get out of here. So if you want to share with our listeners where they can find you and kind of what you're up to next.
Yeah, Marc, and tell us the title of your new book and when that's coming out and where people can get that, because I know a lot of people are going to want to be interested in looking at some of that stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, gents, I really appreciate you guys carving out some time today. The new book's coming out. It's called Peak, the new science of athletic performance that is revolutionizing sports. And the whole idea is to connect people with all the experts on the front lines of performance across team sport, endurance, physique. We talk about athlete health, we talk about fueling, we talk recovery, we talk mindset. And of course, the importance of the fundamentals in all of this, and then diving down the rabbit hole as well with some of the exotic stuff that people can get into. So yeah, they can check that out at all the major bookstores and, you know, Amazon.com as well. And if they want to stay connected with me, social media at Dr. Bubbs. I got a funny last name, so if you just Google that, you'll find all of the relevant links, and I'll make sure my publisher sends you guys over a book as well.
Cool, awesome. And that book is already in stores?
So that'll be May 24th.
Okay, perfect. So by the time this podcast comes out, we'll be getting fairly close to that. So it might be time just about right. But we'll put links into that in the show notes, folks, so you can check it out and take a deep dive into what we talked about today.
Amazing.
All right, Marc, enjoy your time in your sabbatical in the UK. And when,
Appreciate it.
Are you getting back to cannibal basketball in the near future? Is that coming up for you? Is that?
Yeah, so it'll be August is training camp, and we'll be heading over to the World Cup for basketball in September in China. Our under 19s are world champs, so we're hoping we can dovetail that into our senior team.
Very nice. Yeah, I did not realize how much basketball was in Canada. You know, it's kind of everybody thinks hockey about Canada, or I guess lacrosse is your national sport, which most people don't know. But
yeah, nice. That's a good bit of trivia there. Well done. Yeah, that is lacrosse and ice hockey. Yeah, we like to punch each other in the face, and then when we're out of sport, we're sort of the polite nation. But
the nicest guys around afterwards.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
probably the way to do it. Get it all out in the field and be cool afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool.
Fantastic, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Marc.
Appreciate it.
This episode of Human Performance Outliers is brought to you by fellow carnivore and Legal Shield associate Doug Lee. Through Legal Shield's smartphone app, Doug is helping to level the playing field by bringing affordable legal services to everyone right on their phones. For just $24.95 a month, families have instant access to a local team of lawyers working on your behalf, providing legal advice, traffic violation assistance, will preparation, IRS audit assistance, family and domestic services, and contract and document review, just to name a few. Doug also offers ID Shield, the most comprehensive identity protection and recovery service in all of North America. Members get access to a licensed private investigator to help resolve any identity theft issues that arise. Last year alone, there were more than 780 reported data breaches compromising the identities of nearly 170 million people. Responding quickly to ID theft is the best way to prevent serious complications and protect your good name. Doug offers business plans and gun owners plans as well. So head over to douglee.info, that's DOUGLEE.info, to get the app and learn more about how Legal Shield has been protecting families for over 40 years. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Human Performance Outliers Podcast with hosts Dr. Shawn Baker and Zach Bitter. If you enjoyed the show, please consider following us on social media and checking out our websites. Links to those can be found in the show notes. Also, if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to shoot us an email at hpopodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning into the show.